The man who was no one, a ghost woven from secrets and a past he had deliberately set aflame himself, stood utterly still in the relentless, icy downpour that drenched the Confederate capital, feeling the imposing, dark silhouettes of the city's grand buildings, structures that symbolized the cause he was dedicated to destroying from within, stretched towards him like the bars of a gilded cage, their shadows merging with the deepening twilight to swallow him whole, his very existence now a fragile, precarious secret buried under so many intricate layers of lies and fabricated histories that he sometimes, in his most quiet and vulnerable moments in the dead of night, wondered if he had ever been truly real at all, if the boy he vaguely remembered from a farm in Ohio, with grass-stained knees and dreams of being a cartographer, had ever actually lived. Or if he too was just another character in an endless play of deception, a performance that had begun the moment he accepted this damnable, terrifying, and utterly necessary assignment behind enemy lines. The cold Richmond rain seeped through the threadbare wool of his worn, nondescript coat with a persistence that felt personal, a damp chill that settled deep into his bones, yet it was not half as chilling as the sudden, sharp ice that now flooded his veins every time his mind, against his will, replayed the single, catastrophic, and unforgivably amateur error that had unraveled everything in an instant. A mistake not of complex strategy, or a failure of courage under fire, but of a fleeting, foolish, and devastatingly human emotion he had long believed himself professionally incapable of feeling, an emotion he had trained himself to suppress, to extinguish, to treat as a weakness more lethal than a Confederate bullet. That emotion had been a moment of pure, unadulterated compassion for a dying enemy soldier, a young Confederate captain whose life was rapidly ebbing away into the churned, blood-soaked mud of a cornfield at Antietam, a field that had witnessed such obscene carnage that the very soil seemed to weep blood. In that split second, looking down at the boy, for he was little more than a boy, his face pale and clammy, his eyes wide with the shock and terror of his own mortality, the spy had not seen an enemy, a symbol of the rebellion he despised. He had seen only a human being, alone and scared and leaving the world in unimaginable pain, and in a lapse of judgment that now threatened to be his death sentence, he had knelt, his own mission forgotten, and offered a few sips of tepid water from his canteen. A small, futile gesture of mercy in a place that had none. It was during this act of pointless kindness that the brim of his hat had tilted back, and the grime on his face had been partially wiped away by his sleeve, and for a long, terrible moment, his face, his real, unguarded, and unmistakable face, was fully exposed, illuminated by a sudden break in the smoke-filled sky, meeting the glassy, pain-hazed yet acutely aware gaze of the dying captain, a man who should have, by all rights, bled out quietly in that mud minutes later, becoming just another anonymous number in the war's grim ledger. But he had not. Against all odds, against the very logic of warfare and mortality, that Confederate captain had somehow, miraculously, survived his grievous wounds, hauled from the field by a retreating medical corps, patched up by some overworked, harried surgeon, and was now, according to a fragmented, panic-inducing whisper passed through the fragile web of his intelligence network, not only alive but had been reassigned to light duty right here, in the heart of Richmond, a ghost from that blood-soaked field now walking the very same bustling, treacherous streets that the spy now called his prison, a living, breathing, ticking bomb of a man who carried the knowledge of his identity, the one irrevocable truth that could unmask him, the key to his utter annihilation and destruction, locked securely within his memory. This memory, this single, vivid image of a Union spy's face burned into the mind of a Southern officer, was a threat more direct and more personal than any regiment of soldiers or any team of counterintelligence agents. It was a seed that, if allowed to germinate, to be spoken aloud even once in the wrong company, would grow into a vine that would strangle him, would lead the formidable, ruthless apparatus of Confederate counterintelligence directly to his doorstep, would see them tear apart his carefully constructed cover piece by piece, would expose the entire delicate network of agents, sympathizers, and couriers who relied on his absolute anonymity for their own survival, and would inevitably send him to the gallows in Capitol Square as a common spy, a fate he had accepted long ago as a standard professional hazard of his chosen vocation, but which now, with the face of that young captain haunting his every thought, seemed not just likely but terrifyingly, immediately imminent. All because of one face, one witness, One man who could connect the anonymous, bland, utterly forgettable face of the quiet, unassuming, and painfully ordinary tobacco clerk named Elias Finch, a man who shared a cramped boarding house room, who spoke with a carefully practiced Virginian accent, who complained mildly about inflation and rationing along with everyone else, to the most effective, most elusive, and most wanted Union intelligence operative operating deep behind enemy lines, a man known only to a terrified handful of generals in Washington by the solitary and ominous codename Wraith. This name, this spectral title, was one that sent genuine shivers through the upper echelons of the Confederate War Department, a specter blamed for a dozen critical leaked battle plans that had turned certain Southern victories into stalemates or defeats, for diverted supply trains that left entire regiments starving and without ammunition, and for the mysterious, silent disappearances of several key Southern officials who had simply vanished from their beds without a trace, a name that was whispered as a legend, a myth, a horror story told to frighten new recruits, but which was, in the stark, lonely reality of this rain-slicked street, just a man, a desperately tired and frightened man who was currently fighting a rising, tidal wave of pure, undiluted panic, his heart hammering a frantic, runaway rhythm against his ribs that was completely at odds with the calm, placid, almost bored expression he forced onto his features like donning a well-worn mask, a performance he maintained. As he moved with deliberate slowness through the crowded, muddy street, his every sense heightened to an almost painful degree, every minute detail of the world around him sharp and crystal clear, from the pungent smell of wet wool and horse manure and wood smoke that hung thick in the damp air to the sound of horse-drawn carriages and ammunition wagons splashing through the grime, the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, a metallic counterpoint to the nervous, frantic beating of his own heart, his mind racing ahead, calculating, discarding, and formulating plans for the impossible, insane task that now lay directly before him, the task of finding one specific, critically dangerous man in a city teeming with tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians, slaves, and officials, a man whose name he did not know, whose regiment and unit he was entirely unsure of, whose current whereabouts and duties were a complete and utter mystery, a man who was, he was certain, a captain, a fact, gleaned from the single, fleeting glimpse of the insignia on the man's ruined, bloodied uniform that day in the cornfield, a tiny, almost insignificant detail that was now the single, frayed, and fragile thread he had to grasp onto, the only lead in a hostile city that was designed from its very foundations to be his prison and his grave. His original mission, handed to him in a quiet office in Washington by a man with a grave face and a map covered in red pins, which had been to gather specific, detailed intelligence on the new ring of fortifications being built around the city, was now completely secondary, an afterthought fading into irrelevance next to the new, more primal, more deeply personal mission of pure self-preservation, of survival. A mission with a simple, brutal objective, to find that captain, to locate him amidst the countless uniforms of Richmond, and to silence him forever, to extinguish the only living light that could illuminate his true self and bring the entire, meticulously constructed edifice of his fabricated life crashing down in a pile of dust and rope. But to do that, to achieve this monstrous goal, he needed information, he needed access, he needed to become, once again, the true ghost he was famed to be, to slip into the seams and cracks of the city and listen, to haunt the places where officers gathered to drink and forget the war, the smoky taverns and crowded inns and exclusive military clubs where loose talk and gossip and drunken boasts flowed as freely as the cheap whiskey, where stories and rumors and names could be traded, where he might, with immense luck and patience, catch the single, precious nugget of information he so desperately needed, a name, a unit, a location, all while maintaining the exhausting, 24-hour-a-day facade of Elias Finch, a man of little consequence, a man with no strong opinions on the war or politics, a man who simply went about his dull business, his head perpetually down, his past a bland, uninteresting story of a childhood in the South Carolina Low Country, a story he had fabricated with such meticulous, obsessive detail that he could sometimes, in his weariest moments, almost believe it himself, could almost smell the magnolia trees he had never actually seen and feel the oppressive, humid heat of a Carolina summer he had never truly experienced, a past built entirely on a foundation of researched facts, borrowed memories, and outright lies, a fortress of deception that was now under immediate and direct threat of siege, its walls cracking. And as he turned a familiar corner, his eyes automatically scanning the storefronts and faces. With a new, hyper-paranoid intensity, he saw it, a sight that made the breath catch in his throat and his blood run cold, a sight that confirmed his very worst fears and made the abstract threat terrifyingly, viscerally real. Pasted roughly on a brick wall beside a haberdashery, still dripping with fresh, white paste, was a new, freshly printed handbill, a stark proclamation from the office of the Provost Marshal, and on it, rendered in crude but undeniably skilled lines, was a sketch of a face. His face, not the face of the harmless Elias Finch he presented to the world, but the face he had worn before all the lies, the face from Ohio, the face the Confederate captain had seen in that muddy field of death, the face of the man he had once been, a man he had killed and buried years ago in the name of duty. And beneath the unsettlingly accurate sketch, in bold, black, threatening type that seemed to shout from the paper, were the words "wanted" for espionage, and below that a reward, a sum of money so astronomically large it would tempt a saint to sin, offered for any information leading to the capture and conviction of the vile Union spy known throughout the Confederacy as the Wraith. In that moment, standing frozen in the relentless rain, watching a stranger in a gray uniform stop to lean closer and study the poster with keen interest, the entire world seemed to tilt violently on its axis, the sounds of the bustling city, the chatter, the carriages, the distant drills, fading into a dull, roaring silence in his ears, his carefully maintained composure cracking like thin ice under a heavy boot. For they knew his operational codename, they had a description accurate enough to terrify him. The hunt was not some future possibility he had to prevent, it was already underway, it was happening now, at this very moment, and he was the prey, standing exposed and vulnerable in the open, his time measured not in days or weeks, but in hours, perhaps minutes, and the man who as no one knew, with a terrifying and absolute certainty that settled in his soul like a stone, that Elias Finch, the tobacco clerk, had to cease to exist, that every identity, every cover, every layer of deception he had ever painstakingly crafted was now irrevocably compromised and poisoned, that the only way to survive, to have even the faintest ghost of a chance, was to do the one thing no spy could ever truly hope to do and survive, to erase himself completely, utterly, and without a trace, to become a true phantom, to vanish into the ether, to shed every layer of his past, both real and invented, like a snake shedding its skin, and to step forward into the deepening shadows of the war with no name, no history, no future, and no self forever. The decision, cold and absolute as a gravestone, settled upon him not as a choice but as the only remaining law of physics in a world that had just shattered, a fundamental directive for a particle that had to cease its observable existence. And with a finality that was both terrifying and perversely liberating, he turned his back on the dripping poster, on the face of his former self that stared out with the accusatory eyes of a dead man. And he began to walk, not with the panicked flight of a fleeing animal, that would draw the eye, mark him as prey, but with the deliberate, unhurried pace of Elias Finch, a man with nothing more pressing on his mind than getting out of the damnable rain, each step a conscious effort, each placement of his worn boot on the wet cobblestones a measured act of defiance against the scream building in his chest. His mind already a whirlwind of terrifying logistics, a storm of calculations so rapid and complex they felt like a separate consciousness operating at a speed beyond human thought, scouring the mental map of Richmond he had so meticulously built, evaluating every safe house, every dead drop, every potential ally and known informant, and immediately, ruthlessly, discarding them all, for they were part of the network of Elias Finch, part of the legend of the Wraith, and both of those men were now terminal. Their identities bleeding out onto this muddy street, meaning the small, dusty room he rented under the name Finch was a death trap, its few possessions, the spare shirt, the letters from a fictional aunt, the well-thumbed Bible, now nothing more than evidence waiting to be discovered, anchors to a ghost ship he had to abandon, meaning the bakery run by the nervous, keen-eyed widow who passed him messages folded inside loaves of rye bread was now a beacon for his hunters, a connection he could never again approach. Meaning the old Negro fisherman he met at dawn on the James River, exchanging the catch of the day for whispers of troop movements, was now a potential source of his own capture and torture, A thread he had to sever not with a knife but with his absence, meaning he was utterly alone, severed from his own lifelines, a single, rogue cell in the body of the Confederacy that was now rapidly mobilizing its antibodies to find and destroy him, and he was without resources, without a plan. Without a single friend in the world, armed only with the clothes on his back, the few Confederate dollars in his pocket, and the devastating, all-consuming knowledge of what he had to become, a void, a blank space, a man of such profound nothingness that he would leave no ripple in the water of the world, a concept so alien to his very nature as a gatherer of information, a weaver of stories, that it felt like trying to command his own heart to stop beating, yet he knew this was the only path. The path of the true phantom, to move through the world not as a participant but as a shadow, unseen, unheard, unremembered, and his first, most immediate task was to shed the skin of Elias Finch completely, to perform an instant and absolute autopsy on his own identity, and this began with the physical, a checklist of alterations running through his mind as he walked, his eyes now scanning his surroundings not for threats but for opportunities. For the raw materials of his own obliteration, he needed different clothes, something even more common, more worn. Something that would blend into the background of the city's countless laborers and indigents. He needed to change his posture, the slight, habitual stoop of the clerk that was as much a part of the disguise as a false name, and replace it with a different carriage, perhaps the rolling gait of a man accustomed to a ship's deck, or the slumped exhaustion of a factory worker, a new physiology to match his new non-identity. He needed to alter his face, not with the complex prosthetics locked in his now inaccessible room, but with dirt, with deliberate neglect, with a week's growth of beard that would obscure the jawline captured in that damning sketch, and he needed a new place to vanish into, not a room in a boarding house with a curious landlady, but the true shadows of the city, the labyrinthine alleyways where the rats and the desperate lived, the abandoned warehouses along the riverfront that smelled of rot and forgotten commerce, the crowded, raucous shelters where men too poor to afford a name huddled together for warmth, places where a new face would ask no questions because everyone there was hiding from something, places where a man could become invisible simply by being one more piece of human wreckage washed up by the war, and all of this entire transformation into nothingness, had to be accomplished while simultaneously launching the most critical, most urgent mission of his entire career. A mission that paradoxically required him to be more visible, more present, than ever before, for he had to find the captain, he had to move through the very spaces where officers congregated, he had to listen, to ask subtle questions, to be a ghost who haunted specific, well-lit places, all while wearing a disguise of such utter anonymity that it was itself a kind of high-wire act, a performance of nothingness in the spotlight, and the sheer, monstrous contradiction of it threatened to split his mind in two, the part that had to be a hunter, sharp, focused, and aggressive, and the part that had to be prey, passive, hidden, and still, and he felt the first, terrifying tremors of panic not as an emotion, but as a physical shaking in his hands, a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the cold, and he clenched his fists inside his pockets, his nails biting into his palms, using the sharp, clean pain to anchor himself, to focus the whirlwind into a single laser point of intention, because the hunt for the captain began now, this very moment, not later when he was safely hidden, for time was the one weapon he did not possess, and his first, desperate move was to turn his aimless, fleeing walk into a purposeful, though still seemingly casual, journey towards the sounds of clinking glass and loud, masculine laughter, towards the smoky, raucous heart of the officers' district, where the air was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and cheaper whiskey, and where the loose, drunken tongue of a victorious, or defeated, soldier might just let slip a name, a regiment, a story about a captain who cheated death at Antietam. A story that would be the first thread for the ghost to grasp, the first step in a dance that had to end with a man's silence, a silence he would have to impose with his own two hands, and the weight of that future violence, that intimate killing, felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried, a cold, dark promise waiting for him at the end of this path of shadows he had just chosen. A path from which there would be no return to any semblance of the man he once was, even if by some miracle he survived. The path from which there would be no return began not with a dramatic leap into darkness but with a simple, almost mundane turn down a narrower, filthier alley that ran parallel to the main thoroughfare, a damp, shadowed crevice where the grand facades of Richmond gave way to the city's crumbling, neglected brick and rotting wood, a place that suited his new existence perfectly, and as he moved deeper into its confines, the sounds of the city softening to a muffled echo, he began the first, critical phase of his erasure, his hands moving with a practiced, efficient calm that belied the hurricane of fear and resolve raging within him, starting with his coat, the worn garment that was the outermost skin of Elias Finch. He shrugged it off, turning it inside out to reveal a lining that was a different, slightly less faded shade of brown. A simple reversible precaution he had engineered long ago for a moment he had always hoped would never come, and then he rolled it into a tight, compact bundle, tucking it under his arm, instantly altering his silhouette from that of a slightly shabby clerk to something less defined, more ambiguous, a man without a clear station. Next came his hat, a simple felt bowler that was too associated with the character he was shedding. He peeled it from his head, ran his fingers through his hair, musing it thoroughly, breaking its careful part, and then he scooped a handful of the cold, greasy mud from a puddle by a drain pipe, working it into his hair with a grimace of distaste, matting it, darkening it, adding streaks of grime to his forehead and the back of his neck, the grime acting as a primitive form of camouflage, breaking up the familiar lines of his face, the first layer of a new, filthier identity. He then unbuttoned his waistcoat, loosened his tie, and stuffed the ends into his pocket, transforming his neat, if worn, appearance into one of dishevelment, of a man who had given up on propriety, a small but significant step towards invisibility among the city's countless down and out. His walk changed next, the measured, slightly hesitant pace of Finch giving way to a more rolling, shoulder-heavy gait, a walk that suggested a man who was tired, perhaps a laborer from the nearby Tredegar Iron Works, his boots scuffing deliberately on the cobbles, his shoulders slumping forward as if carrying a great weight, his head tilting down so that his face, now dirty and partially obscured by the lank, muddy strands of hair, was angled away from the casual glance of anyone he might pass. Every sense remained hyper-alert, not just for the obvious threat of patrolling guards or suspicious civilians, but for the raw materials of his continued transformation. His eyes, scanning the ground and the piles of refuse in the alley, found a discarded, torn piece of sacking, which he snatched up and draped over his head and shoulders like a crude shawl, further altering his outline and providing an additional layer of protection against the relentless rain and prying eyes. He was no longer Elias Finch, but he was not yet anyone else. He was a creature in transition, a blur in the periphery, and his destination now was the river, the lifeblood of the city and also its sewer, a place of constant movement and noise where a lone, bedraggled figure would attract no notice, a place where the sprawling, ramshackle structures of the waterfront offered 1,000 dark corners in which to vanish completely. He needed to find a specific type of refuge, not just any abandoned building, but one that was both forgotten and yet offered some form of observation point, a lair from which the ghost could observe the world it had just left. And as he moved, his mind, that sharp, analytical tool that was his greatest weapon, began to compartmentalize, to split its focus with a schizophrenic intensity that was the only way to manage the impossible duality of his tasks. One part of his consciousness was dedicated solely to navigation and survival, reading the streets for danger, plotting a route that avoided patrols and checkpoints, while another, deeper part began to construct the architecture of his hunt, building a mental dossier on his prey. The captain was young, that much he remembered clearly from the field, perhaps mid-20s, with a face that had not yet been fully hardened by war, which suggested a certain background, likely educated, possibly from a family of some means to secure a commission, which in turn might mean he would frequent the more established, traditional officer haunts rather than the rowdiest of taverns. He was from Antietam, which meant his regiment was most likely from Maryland or Virginia, a fact that could narrow the search immensely if he could find a way to access garrison records or overhear talk of which units had been mauled in that battle and were now reassigned to the capital for reorganization. He would be convalescing, perhaps still walking with a limp, maybe favoring a side, a physical characteristic that could make him stand out in a crowd. This was the profile he would hunt for, this ghost of a ghost, and the hunt would require him to be bold, to drift like a phantom through the very places he should now fear the most. The taverns near the military headquarters, the parks where officers took their leisure, the train stations where troops came and went. He would have to become a master of listening, of catching fragments of conversation from across a smoky room, of asking a single, innocuous question to a drunkard and then vanishing before any suspicion could be aroused. He would have to be a student of body language, of insignia, of the subtle hierarchies of the Confederate Army, all while wearing the cloak of utter insignificance himself. And underpinning it all, the cold, dark engine of his resolve, the knowledge that finding the man was only half the mission. The other half was an act of violence that would forever stain whatever remained of his soul, a necessary murder that would complete his own transformation into the nameless, faceless weapon he now had to become, a final, bloody baptism into the nothingness that was his only hope of survival. The man who had been the Wraith, who had been Elias Finch, was gone. What moved through the alley now was something else entirely, a purpose made flesh, a shadow with a single, terrible goal, stepping out of the narrow lane and onto the broader, chaotic expanse of the riverfront, where the wind carried the smell of fish, rot, and industry, and where 1,000 stories of desperation played out daily, providing the perfect cover for one more. The perfect cover for one more story of desperation presented itself not as a single opportunity but as a vast, sprawling panorama of decay and fleeting industry, the James River waterfront unfolding before him like a chaotic, living map of his own fractured state, a place where the grandeur of the Confederacy's ambitions met the grim reality of its struggles, where sleek, blockade-running steamers shared dock space with listing, skeletal barges and forgotten hulks rotting at their moorings, where the air was a thick soup of conflicting smells. The tang of fish and river mud, the acrid bite of coal smoke from the Tredegar works, the Swedish stench of curing tobacco from the nearby warehouses, and the pervasive, underlying odor of unwashed humanity and despair. This was a borderland, a place between the ordered world of the city and the wild flow of the river, where the rules were blurred and survival was the only law, and he absorbed it all in one sweeping, calculating glance, his eyes, sharpened by years of observation and a newfound, primal urgency, discarding a dozen potential hiding places in seconds. A tarpaulin-covered wagon was too temporary. A stack of cotton bales too exposed, a group of drunken laborers too unpredictable, until his gaze settled on the far end of the wharf, where the skeleton of a half-built schooner, a project likely abandoned as the war consumed all resources and timber, stood shrouded in shadows against the gunmetal sky, its ribs exposed like the carcass of some great beast, offering a dark, complex labyrinth of platforms, rope coils, and tarpaulins stretched against the weather. It was perfect, a forgotten place in a place of constant motion, offering both concealment and a vantage point. The journey towards it was a lesson in this new, brutal form of existence. He had to move through the crowds of dockworkers, soldiers overseeing shipments, slaves hauling crates, and vendors selling dubious wares, not as a man with purpose, but as a piece of human flotsam, buffeted by the currents of the crowd, his body language screaming of fatigue and defeat, his eyes downcast but missing nothing. Every sense tuned to the frequency of threat and opportunity. He passed a pair of provost guards, their uniforms crisp despite the rain, their eyes scanning the crowds with a lazy arrogance that was more dangerous than outright suspicion, and he instinctively hunched further, coughing into his fist, a wet, rasping sound that made the nearest guard wrinkle his nose in disgust and look away. Precisely the reaction he had hoped for. He was beneath their notice. Just another piece of the human debris the war created in abundance. He shuffled past the group of sailors arguing over a dice game, their accents a mix of Irish and deep southern drawl, and he caught a fragment of conversation about a captain who had lost a fortune on a shipment of English rifles that had been intercepted, and for a heart-stopping second, he thought they meant his captain, but the context was all wrong. It was a financial loss, not a physical one. And he filed the information away nonetheless, a tiny data point in the vast unknown. He saw a newspaper, wet and trampled into the mud, the headline screaming about Union advances, and he resisted the urge to pick it up, knowing that even that small act of literacy could mark him as different from the uneducated mass he was now trying to emulate. He was a blank slate, absorbing impressions but giving nothing back, a void moving through the chaos, and finally, he reached the shadows of the skeletal ship, slipping between two great wooden ribs into a space that was dark, cold, and smelled of damp wood and pitch. He allowed himself a single, shuddering breath, the first moment of relative solitude since seeing the poster, and the full weight of his situation crashed down upon him with the physical force, the fear and the loneliness, a cold knot in his stomach. But he could not afford to feel it. Not yet. He had to work. He had to build his new reality from nothing. His hands, moving with an automatic efficiency, began to explore his new domain, finding a small, relatively dry space beneath a sagging tarpaulin that was lashed over a partially completed deck, a space just large enough for him to curl up in, hidden from view from all sides, a foxhole in the heart of the enemy city. This would be his nest, his observation post, his home for however long he had left. He concealed his bundled coat there, his one spare resource, and then turned his attention to his immediate needs: water, which he could catch from the runoff of the tarpaulin; food, which would be a problem he would have to solve through scavenging or theft, a new and dangerous line to cross; and information, which was the oxygen he needed to survive. The light was beginning to fail, the gray afternoon deepening into a premature, rain-lashed twilight, and with the darkness came a new kind of energy along the waterfront, the shift change at the ironworks sending a flood of exhausted men towards the taverns, the lanterns in the windows of the drinking establishments flaring to life, promising warmth and forgetfulness, and he knew this was his time, the first foray of the hunt. He had to go back into the beast's mouth, to the very places where his likeness was now likely being pinned to walls, to listen for the one voice that held the key to his survival. Positioning himself in a shadowy crook of the ship's frame that offered a clear view of the entrance to a popular tavern called the Anchor's Rest, a place known to be frequented by junior officers, he settled in to wait, to watch, to become a part of the darkness, his body perfectly still, his breathing shallow, his eyes scanning every figure that approached the glowing door, every uniform, every face, looking for a limp, a sling, any sign of a recent, serious injury, listening for any snatch of conversation that mentioned Antietam, or a miraculous recovery, or a captain who had returned from the dead, the silence within him a stark contrast to the roaring need in his veins, the hunter now fully awake in the darkness, patient, deadly, and utterly alone in the deepening gloom. The hunter's patience became a tangible force, a cold, coiled spring within him that tightened with each passing minute. Each laugh that spilled from the tavern's door into the wet night air, feeling like a personal taunt, each clatter of hoof on stone or jingle of harness making him flinch internally, his body a statue of grime and tension, while his mind raced, processing every fragment of sensory data with a hyper-focused intensity that was both a gift and a curse, the weight of the impending violence a dark star around which all his thoughts now orbited. A necessary evil that he had to not only commit but to perfect, to execute with a clinical detachment that would leave no room for error, for emotion, for the haunting memory of the boy's face in the mud that had started this entire descent into hell. And as he watched the comings and goings at the Anchor's Rest, his strategic mind began to outline the grim parameters of the act itself, the how and where and when of this murder he must perform, knowing that it could not be a crime of passion, a messy public affair that would bring the full wrath of the Confederate military police down upon the waterfront, turning his already precarious hiding place into a fortified hunting ground with him as the quarry. It had to be quiet, efficient, and most importantly, it had to look like anything but what it was: an assassination. An accident, perhaps, a drunken fall from a dockside into the cold, swift current of the James, a body that might not surface for days, if ever, its injuries attributed to the rocks and the flow of the river. A robbery gone wrong in some dark alley, a common enough occurrence in a city straining under the pressure of war, the captain's pockets turned out, his watch and wallet gone, a motive any Richmond constable would understand and quickly file away. Or perhaps something even more subtle, an illness, a sudden, violent fever that could be induced with certain poisons available to a knowledgeable individual, a death that would occur behind closed doors, in a sickbed, arousing pity rather than suspicion. Each option presented its own logistical nightmare, its own requirements for access, for timing, for materials he did not possess, adding layers of complexity to an already impossible mission, and all of it hinged on the first, most critical step, identification, the simple, monumental task of finding the right man in the teeming thousands of this city. A task that felt increasingly hopeless as the evening wore on and the tavern disgorged a seemingly endless parade of greycoats, men with loud voices and boisterous camaraderie, men with limps from old childhood injuries, men with arms and slings from recent training accidents, but none of them the limp, the face, the one that was seared into his memory with the clarity of a lightning strike. The rain began to fall harder, sheeting across the waterfront, drumming a relentless rhythm on the tarpaulin above his head, reducing the world to a blurred, shimmering tableau of lantern light and shadows, and the cold, which had been a persistent nuisance, now began to bite deep, seeping through his thin, damp clothes, threatening to trigger uncontrollable shivers that would betray his position, forcing him to clamp his muscles rigid, to fight his own biology in order to maintain his frozen watch, the discomfort a stark reminder of his vulnerability, of how quickly exposure could weaken him, could cloud his judgment, could kill him just as surely as a Confederate bullet. He needed better shelter than this, real sustenance, but leaving his post now felt like an unacceptable risk, a dereliction of his only duty, and so he remained, a sentinel in the dark, his hope beginning to curdle into a sour desperation, the first whispers of doubt insinuating themselves into his mind. What if his information was wrong? What if the captain had died days after Antietam, his survival just a campfire story? What if he had been transferred to another city, to Tennessee or Georgia? What if he was, at this very moment, sitting in a comfortable parlor miles away, describing the face of the Union spy to a keenly interested intelligence officer who was even now preparing a better, more accurate sketch for distribution? The questions were a form of torture, each one a twist of the knife, and he was on the verge of abandoning his watch, of retreating into his miserable nest to regroup and formulate a new approach, when he saw them, a group of 3 officers emerging from the tavern, their steps unsteady, their voices raised in a drunken rendition of a popular Southern ballad, and the one in the middle, supported slightly by his comrades, was tall and lean, with a head of fair hair darkened by the rain, and he walked with a pronounced, sharp hitch in his step, his right leg seeming to buckle slightly with every other pace, his hand occasionally going to his thigh to rub at a spot high up, near the hip, a gesture of unconscious pain that screamed of a recent, traumatic wound. The spy's entire world narrowed to that limping figure, the sounds of the river and the rain fading into a dull hum, his breath catching in his throat, every ounce of his being focused on the man's face as he passed under a misty halo of light from a nearby gas lamp, and there, in the play of shadow and wet light, he saw it, the features, younger than he remembered, cleansed of mud and the rictus of pain, but unmistakably the same. The set of the jaw, the arch of the brow, the mouth that was now smiling at a joke from his friend, a mouth that had been twisted in a silent scream the last time he had seen it. It was him. Captain? The name was still a void, a blank space in his knowledge, but the face was now here, real, breathing, laughing, living a life that, in minutes, had become a countdown to its end. The group moved away, heading towards the residential streets, their voices growing fainter, and the spy remained frozen, not in stillness now, but in a profound, seismic shock of confirmation, the hunt suddenly over, the prey identified, and the far more dangerous game of stalker and executioner now beginning, a game he had to win with a perfect, flawless strategy, starting with the most basic rule of shadowing. He had to let them get ahead, to become specks in the rain. Before he would move, a phantom leaving its perch to follow, to learn the captain's habits, his routes, his home, to find the perfect place and the perfect time to ensure that the man who carried his death warrant in his memory would never, ever get a chance to speak it aloud. The perfect place and the perfect time to ensure the man who carried his death warrant in his memory would never, ever get a chance to speak it aloud began to formulate not as a detailed plan, but as a series of instinctual, lightning-fast calculations made in the heartbeat it took for the 3 officers to become blurred, receding shapes in the curtain of rain, their laughter swallowed by the downpour and the constant low groan of the river, the spy's body uncoiling from its frozen state with a predator's fluid grace, every muscle protesting the sudden movement after hours of tense immobility, the cold having settled deep into his joints. But the discomfort was a distant echo, secondary to the primal, singular focus that now governed him, his entire consciousness funneled into the act of pursuit, of becoming an unseen shadow attached to these men by an invisible tether. His first few steps out from the skeletal ribs of the ship were cautious, measured, his eyes fixed on the distant figures while his other senses scanned his immediate vicinity for any observers. Any late-night dock workers or patrolling guards who might witness this emergence of a ragged figure from the darkness. but the waterfront was largely deserted now, the weather having driven all but the most desperate or dedicated indoors, leaving the cobbled streets shimmering and empty under the feeble glow of the gas lamps, and he used this to his advantage, moving from one pool of deep shadow to the next, his new, rolling gait eating up the distance without appearing hurried, his form hunched under the sackcloth, making him just another indistinct moving shadow in a world of shadows, the distance between him and the officers carefully maintained constant, enough that their conversation was just a muffled rumble, their forms occasionally disappearing behind a curtain of particularly heavy rain before reappearing again, a constant test of his nerve, each disappearance a tiny agony of uncertainty, fearing they had turned a corner he had not seen, that he had lost them already. But they remained on the main thoroughfare leading away from the river and into the more respectable, residential sections of the city, where the buildings stood taller and closer together, their brick facades offering some shelter from the weather but also creating a canyon of echoing sounds and shifting light that made the tailing operation infinitely more complex. He had to hang back further now, using the reflections in wet windows to track their progress, ducking into doorways when one of the men paused to adjust his coat or light a pipe, his heart hammering against his ribs each time, certain he had been spotted, that a shout would ring out, but the alcohol and the camaraderie made them oblivious to the world around them, locked in their own bubble of conversation and shared warmth, and he listened, straining his ears for any useful fragment, any name, any specific detail, and was rewarded when the captain's voice, clearer and more refined than the others, rose above the patter of rain, saying, "Aunt Louisa's on Gray Street will have my hide if I track mud on her Persian rugs again. Lads, I swear that woman values her carpets more than she values Southern independence." Followed by a burst of laughter from his companions, and the spy's mind, that voracious cataloguer of information, seized upon the words, Gray Street, and Louisa, a specific location, a person, a golden nugget of intelligence that transformed the captain from a fleeting target into a man with an address, a routine, a life that could be studied and predicted. The group paused at an intersection, the two supporting officers clapping the captain on the shoulder in farewell, turning off towards a different street, leaving the limping man to continue on alone, a development that sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through the spy. The prey was isolated, vulnerable. The perfect opportunity for a swift, silent attack presented itself, the dark, empty street beckoning, but he immediately, ruthlessly suppressed the impulse. It was too soon, too reckless, a move born of desperation, not strategy. A attack now, in the open, with no clear escape route and no way to stage the death as an accident, would be suicide, a swift end to his mission and his life, and so he held back, continuing his shadowing as the captain, now alone and moving more slowly, favoring his leg more noticeably without the support of his friends, turned onto a wider, tree-lined avenue, Grace Street, a street of handsome, three-story townhouses. Homes of merchants and mid-level officers, their windows mostly dark, their steps clean and imposing. The spy now had to become a true phantom, melting into the scant cover of bare-limbed trees and the deep porches of the houses, his progress a series of frozen pauses and darting movements, his breathing shallow, watching as the captain climbed the steps of a particularly well-kept red-brick house with a black lacquered door and gleaming brass fittings, number 214, the spy's eyes recording every detail, the position of the windows, the drain pipe that ran near what was likely the second floor bedroom, the lock on the door, the lack of any obvious slave quarters or servant's entrance in the rear, suggesting a household run by the fastidious Aunt Louisa herself, perhaps with the day maid. The captain fumbled for a key, unlocked the door, and disappeared inside, a warm sliver of lamplight briefly cutting into the darkness before being extinguished as the door closed, and the spy was alone again on the silent, rain-swept street, the echo of the closing door sounding like the ceiling of a tomb. But whose tomb, he wondered? He remained motionless for a long time, long after the lights in the front parlor, and then an upstairs window had been lit and subsequently extinguished, studying the patterns of the house, the rhythms of the neighborhood, the passage of a lone watchman on his rounds, the distant chime of a church bell marking the hour, embedding the geography of this place into his memory, mapping every potential approach and escape route, every shadowed alcove, every possible line of sight from the surrounding windows, his mind already weaving scenarios, discarding the poison idea. too difficult to acquire and administer, leaning towards the river accident, but that would require luring the captain back to the waterfront, a complicated ruse, or perhaps a fall down these very steps, a tragic tumble after a night of drinking, his head striking the iron railing, a simple, believable domestic accident. The cold was intensifying, a deep, penetrating chill that promised frost by morning, and he knew he could not stay here all night. He had his own survival to attend to, his own weakening body to fortify against the elements. With one last, long look at the silent facade of 214 Grace Street, he retreated, slipping back the way he had come, his mind no longer a whirlwind of panic but a calm, cold engine of purpose, the hunter now knowing exactly where his quarry denayed, the next phase of the operation clear. Observation, learning the captain's schedule, his habits, his vulnerabilities, and the acquisition of the simple, brutal tools required for the work ahead, a task that would take him back into the city's underbelly, into the world of thieves and scavengers, a world where a man with a few Confederate dollars and no questions to ask could acquire a length of stout wire, a sharpened piece of metal, or a weighted sap, tools of anonymous violence that would be the instruments of his salvation and the captain's damnation, the final, bloody steps on the path to becoming no one. The final bloody steps on the path to becoming no one began not with a violent act, but with a retreat, a conscious withdrawal from the tantalizing proximity of his quarry back into the consuming darkness of the waterfront, the image of the handsome red brick house on Grace Street burning in his mind like a fixed beacon, a point of absolute focus around which all his subsequent movements would now orbit, his body moving on autopilot through the deserted, rain-lashed streets, the euphoria of identification now replaced by the grinding, practical realities of execution and survival, his mind partitioning itself into separate, functioning units, one unit focused solely on the immediate physical task of returning to his makeshift lair without being seen, his senses hyper-aware of every shifting shadow and distant footfall, another unit already cataloging the intelligence gleaned from the night stalk, the captain's vulnerability when alone, his slight build, the pronounced limp that would hinder any struggle, the predictable sanctuary of Aunt Louise's house, a location that offered both advantages and complications, its residential respectability meaning fewer prying eyes at night but also a greater potential for outcry if any noise was made, a calculated risk. But the most dominant unit of his mind was now consumed with the logistics of the tool, the instrument of silence he needed to acquire, a problem that required him to descend into a stratum of Richmond's society even lower and more dangerous than the one he currently inhabited, a world where the war was a distant abstraction compared to the immediate demands of hunger and vice. A world where a man could buy a murder weapon for the price of a meal, or a bottle of cheap whiskey. And it was towards this shadow economy that he now turned his steps, not back to the relative familiarity of the docks but deeper into the tangled, stinking warren of alleys that lay behind the main commercial streets, a place known colloquially as the sinks, where the buildings leaned against each other for support, where raw sewage trickled in open gutters, and where the desperate and the criminal conducted their business in hissed whispers and quick, furtive exchanges. Here, the darkness was almost absolute, broken only by the faint glow of candlelight from behind boarded-up windows, and the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap gin, and cooking grease of questionable origin. He was no longer the hunter of a specific man. He was now a scavenger, a predator in a jungle of other predators, and his posture shifted accordingly, the rolling gait of the laborer hardening into something more furtive, more aggressive, his eyes glinting with a calculated menace from beneath the sodden fringe of his hair, his hand occasionally brushing against the rough brick of a wall as if for balance, but in reality ensuring the makeshift shank he had fashioned earlier from a sharpened piece of barrel hoop was still secure in his waistband, a pathetic weapon but better than nothing in this place. He needed to find a specific type of individual, not an organized gangster who would ask too many questions, but a lone wolf, a desperate addict or a petty thief who would have something to sell and no memory to speak of afterwards. He found what he was looking for in a dead-end alley, a figure huddled in a doorway, shivering violently, not from the cold but from the need for a substance his body could no longer function without, the man's eyes wide and vacant in a skeletal face, his fingers picking incessantly at the frayed cuffs of his coat. The spy approached slowly, not with the hesitant step of a victim, but with the deliberate, confident stride of a fellow predator, his voice, When he spoke, a low, gravelly rasp that was nothing like the refined tones of Elias Finch or the neutral accent of the Wraith. It was the voice of the streets, a voice he had learned long ago and now resurrected from the depths of his memory. "Evenin'," he grunted, stopping a few feet away, his body angled to present a smaller target, his hand resting near his waistband. The addict's eyes flickered up, showing a flicker of fear and then a calculating greed. "I ain't got nothin'," the man whined, pulling his coat tighter. "Lookin' to buy and not take," the spy said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Need something quiet. Something that don't make a fuss." He made a subtle gesture with his hand, a universal sign in the underworld for a garrote or a strangling wire. The addict's eyes narrowed, understanding dawning, and a sly, gap-toothed smile spread across his face. "Quiet costs extra," he hissed. "Ain't got extra. Got $2 Confederate," the spy said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation, his body tensing, ready to react if the man decided to try and take the money by force. The addict seemed to weigh his options, his need for his next fix warring with his sense of profit, but the need won, as it always did. He nodded jerkily towards the overflowing rubbish heap further down the alley. "Behind that. Loose brick third from the bottom. Left side. Thing you want is wrapped in oilcloth. Leave the money on the ground." The spy didn't move immediately. He held the man's gaze for a long moment, ensuring this wasn't a trap, that there wasn't a friend lurking in the deeper shadows. Seeing only desperate avarice, he gave a curt nod, turned, and walked to the rubbish heap, his back feeling intensely vulnerable, his ears straining for any sound of movement. He found the loose brick, pried it out, and felt the small, hard bundle wrapped in greasy cloth. He didn't unwrap it here. The feel of it, a flexible wire with two wooden handles, was confirmation enough. He slipped it into his pocket, took out the two wrinkled bills, and dropped them on the wet ground without looking back. He heard a scrambling sound behind him as the addict lunged for the money, but he was already moving, melting back into the maze of alleys, the weight of the wire in his pocket feeling like the weight of a planet, a cold, deadly promise that made the coming act terrifyingly real. He had the tool. He had the target's location. Now, he needed the perfect moment, a window of opportunity that would open and close in a matter of seconds, and he had to be there, ready to step through it, to complete his transformation from a man into a story that would never be told, a ghost that would haunt the streets of Richmond long after the war was over, a permanent, nameless resident of the shadows he was about to claim as his only kingdom. A permanent, nameless resident of the shadows he was about to claim as his only kingdom. Required not just the will to act and the tool for violence, but an intimate, obsessive knowledge of the battlefield, and so the next phase of his existence settled into a grim, monotonous rhythm of surveillance and deprivation, his life reducing itself to the confines of his damp nest beneath the tarpaulin on the skeletal ship by day, a place of shivering, fitful rest where he slept with one eye open. The cold wire in his pocket a constant, chilling reminder of his purpose, and the shadowed doorways and rain-swept vantage points around 214 Grey Street by night, where he became a fixture of the darkness, a part of the scenery as unchanging and unnoticed as the iron hitching post or the leafless magnolia tree in the tiny front garden, his patience now infinite, his focus absolute, his entire being dedicated to the study of one man's life, learning its patterns and rhythms with the devotion of a scholar studying a sacred text. He noted the precise time the lamplighter came by each evening, and when the watchman made his rounds, memorizing the gaps in their surveillance. He learned that Aunt Louisa, a stern-faced woman in a high-necked black dress, left the house every morning at 9:30 precisely, a woven market basket on her arm, returning 2 hours later, her purchases for the day completed. He learned that a young slave girl arrived at 7 each morning to clean and help with the cooking, departing at 3 in the afternoon, her head always bowed, a fact that meant the house was empty of servants in the evening, a critical piece of information. And most importantly, he learned the captain's habits, that he left the house each morning at 8, his uniform neat, his limp still pronounced but less severe after a night's rest, heading towards the War Department buildings, and that he returned each evening, his steps slower, more fatigued, usually between 6 and 7 o'clock, and that on Tuesdays and Fridays, he went out again after supper, around 8:30, alone. His path always leading towards the same destination, a small, discreet social club for officers a few blocks away, a place where he would remain for exactly 2 hours before making his way home, always alone, always taking the same route, a man of habit, of routine, a predictability that was a luxury his station afforded him but which was now a fatal vulnerability, a painted arrow pointing towards his own demise. It was this Tuesday night ritual that presented itself as the most promising opportunity, the walk home from the club taking him along a section of street that was particularly ill-lit, where the grand homes had high walls and locked gates, and where a large ancient oak tree spread its bare branches over the sidewalk, creating a pool of profound darkness that lasted for a crucial 15 feet, a perfect ambush point. A stage set for a silent tragedy. For 3 nights, the spy watched this ritual, confirming its consistency, mapping every step, every potential variable, a barking dog in a nearby yard, a particular carriage that sometimes passed at that hour, the location of every window that might have a line of sight to the killing ground, until he knew it better than he knew the feel of his own breath. The wire in his pocket began to feel less like a foreign object and more like an extension of his own hand, a part of his anatomy that existed for this single, terrible purpose. He practiced the motions in the absolute blackness of his lair, the feel of the handles in his palms, the swift, encircling movement, the brutal, efficient pull that would cut off air and blood, that would bring a swift, silent end, his muscles memorizing the choreography of murder, his mind hardening itself against the image of the boy's face that tried to intrude, replacing it with the cold, clinical image of a target. A threat, a problem to be solved. The night of the planned execution arrived with a strange, surreal stillness, the rain having finally ceased, leaving a clear, cold sky and a bright, indifferent moon that cast sharp black shadows, ideal conditions for what he had to do, the clarity of the night feeling like a cosmic approval of his dark mission. He left the waterfront early, positioning himself in the deep shadows of a recessed doorway 100 yards from the oak tree, his body humming with a terrifying cocktail of adrenaline and a cold, detached calm, every sense so acutely tuned that he could hear the rustle of a rat in the leaves across the street, could see the individual bricks in the wall opposite, could feel the beat of his own heart as a slow, deliberate drum counting down the seconds. He watched the captain enter the club at 8:30 on the dot, a flash of his fair hair under the lantern light by the door, and then the long, agonizing wait began, 2 hours stretching before him like an eternity, each minute a lifetime of doubt and resolve warring within him, the voice of the man he used to be screaming that this was madness, that there had to be another way, that he was about to cross a line from which there was no return. A line that would stain his soul forever, and the voice of the survivor, the ghost, the wraith, coldly and logically silencing it, reiterating the simple equation, the captain's life for his own, for the network, for the cause, a necessary sacrifice in a war built on sacrifices. He remained motionless, a part of the stonework, his breath pluming in the cold air, the wire in his pocket feeling like a live thing, a serpent waiting to strike. Then, at 10:28, 2 minutes early, the door of the club opened, and the captain emerged, pulling on his gloves, nodding a farewell to someone inside, and then he turned, alone, and began his walk home, his familiar, slightly uneven gait echoing on the quiet street. The spy felt a terrifying stillness descend upon him, all doubt extinguished, all emotion locked away in a deep vault, leaving only the pure, crystalline focus of the predator. He waited until the captain had passed his doorway, then he slipped out, moving parallel to him on the other side of the street, keeping to the deepest shadows, a silent phantom matching his pace, closing the distance with each silent step, his eyes fixed on the man's back, on the vulnerable space between his collar and his hat, his hands already moving towards his pocket, fingers closing around the cold, wooden handles of the wire. The world narrowing to the stretch of sidewalk under the dark oak tree, now just 50 feet away, 30, 20, the captain humming a tune under his breath, completely unaware that death was stalking him, was now directly behind him, raising the wire, the loop opening like a jaw, ready to descend, to complete the erasure, to secure his own immortality as a ghost. 10 feet. 5. The spy took a final, silent step, his arms coming up, and a door slammed open further down the street, light and laughter spilling out, a group of officers spilling onto the sidewalk, their voices loud and boisterous, directly on the captain's path. The spy froze, the wire millimeters from its target, his entire body screaming in frustration, and in that split second of hesitation, the captain, alerted by the noise ahead, half-turned, his profile caught in the distant light, and for a heart-stopping instant, his eyes, vague and slightly unfocused from drink, seemed to look directly into the shadows where the spy stood, not seeing him, not really, but sensing a movement. A presence, a flicker of something that made him pause, his humming ceasing, his head tilting in curiosity, as the group of laughing officers moved towards him, calling his name in greeting, their arrival shattering the perfect moment, closing the window of opportunity with a deafening, final crash, forcing the spy to melt back into the absolute darkness, the wire slipping back into his pocket, his chance gone, the hunt foiled not by failure, but by the cruel, random interference of fate. Leaving him standing in the shadows, shaking not with cold, but with the adrenaline crash of aborted violence, watching his target walk away, surrounded by friends, alive, still a threat, the wire in his pocket now feeling not like a tool, but like a curse. The wire in his pocket now feeling not like a tool, but like a curse, a heavy, coiled serpent of failed intent that seemed to leech what little warmth remained in his body. The spy retreated from the pool of darkness under the oak tree. His movements no longer those of a fluid predator but of a creature stunned. Reeling from the whiplash of aborted action, the adrenaline that had fueled his purpose now curdling in his veins into a toxic sludge of frustration and a cold, creeping dread, for the opportunity had been perfect, the stage set, his resolve absolute, and yet chance, that fickle and merciless god of warfare and espionage, had intervened in the form of laughing officers and a slamming door, leaving him not only with his mission unaccomplished but with a new, more terrifying problem. The captain's pause, that half-turn, the vague, drink-hazed look into the shadows, had it been simple curiosity, the natural reaction to a peripheral flicker of movement, or had some deeper, subconscious instinct, some primal survival sense honed on the bloody fields of Antietam, triggered an alarm in the man's mind, leaving him with a lingering, undefined unease that might, upon reflection in the sober light of morning, crystallize into suspicion? This question became a worm of anxiety burrowing deep into the spy's mind as he fled the scene, not back towards the main thoroughfare but deeper into the labyrinth of back alleys that crisscrossed the affluent neighborhood, his ears straining for any sound of pursuit, any shouted alarm, but hearing only the fading laughter of the officers and the frantic beating of his own heart, the normal sounds of the night suddenly pregnant with threat. Every distant footfall becoming a potential patrol. Every sliver of light from a window feeling like an accusing eye. He had to assume the worst, that the captain's glance had been more than random, that the seed of suspicion had been planted, and that changed everything. The captain was now potentially alert, a warned man who might alter his routines, might become more cautious, might even report a feeling of being watched, which would bring a different, more dangerous kind of attention to Grace Street, attention that could easily uncover a ragged, lurking figure who did not belong. The hunter was in danger of becoming the hunted in a much more immediate sense, and his carefully laid plan was in ashes, forcing him to retreat not just physically but strategically, to fall back to his lair and reconsider the entire operation from a position of suddenly heightened vulnerability. The journey back to the waterfront was a nightmare of heightened paranoia, every shadow holding a potential enemy, every sound a potential trap, his hand never leaving the wire in his pocket, not as a tool for attack anymore, but as a last, desperate means of defense if he were cornered, the object's purpose transforming in his mind from an instrument of proactive salvation to one of reactive survival. When he finally slipped back between the wooden ribs of the skeletal ship, the familiar darkness of his nest felt less like a sanctuary and more like a trap, a damp, cold hole where he was cornered, and for the first time since seeing the wanted poster, a profound, soul-crushing despair threatened to overwhelm him, the sheer magnitude of his task, the incredible bad luck of the aborted attack, and the relentless physical misery of cold, hunger, and exhaustion converging into a black wave that made him want to simply lie down on the wet planking and give up, to let the cold take him and be done with it. But the face of the captain, now sharpened by that moment of near discovery, flashed behind his eyes, not as the boy in the mud, but as the man who held the power of life and death over him, a man who was now perhaps aware of the specter on his trail, and that image ignited a spark of defiant anger that burned away the despair. Giving up was not an option, it never had been. He had to adapt, to evolve his strategy immediately. The clean, silent ambush was likely no longer viable. The captain would be on edge, perhaps avoiding dark streets, perhaps varying his routes. A new approach was needed, something bolder, something that could be executed in a different location, perhaps even exploiting the captain's potential heightened awareness against him. His mind, refusing to surrender, began to race through alternatives, each more audacious and dangerous than the last. Could he gain access to the house itself? During the day when Aunt Louisa and the slave girl were out, the risk was astronomical. A neighbor might see him, the captain might return unexpectedly, he would be trapped inside a private residence with no easy escape. What about the social club? Too many people, too many witnesses. His original idea of a staged accident on the riverfront came back to him, but luring the captain there now seemed impossible. He needed to create a new opportunity, to force a situation where the captain was isolated and vulnerable in a way he would not expect. And then it came to him, a plan so fraught with risk it bordered on insanity, but one that addressed the new variable of the captain's potential alertness. He would not ambush the captain. He would confront him. Not as himself, of course, but under a new, hastily constructed guise. He would become a messenger, a desperate courier from the front with news of the captain's old unit, with a forged letter that required immediate, private discussion, a ruse that would play on the captain's sense of duty and camaraderie, a story designed to lure him to a location of the spy's choosing, a place where the river's current could tell the final story. It was a plan that required new tools, paper, ink, a specific knowledge of military phrasing and the captain's regiment, which he would have to glean by taking even greater risks, by getting closer than ever before, by listening outside the War Department, or perhaps even following the captain to his place of work to see his unit insignia clearly. It also required a new level of theatrical commitment, a performance that would have to be flawless under the direct scrutiny of his target. The wire in his pocket, that cursed object, would still be the final instrument, but its use would come after a conversation, after a moment of ultimate psychological tension. The sheer audacity of the plan sent a fresh chill through him, but it was a chill of purpose, a direction out of the despair. The failed attack under the oak tree was no longer a catastrophe. It was a lesson, a forcing function that was pushing him towards a more complex, more intimate, and more terrifyingly personal form of murder. He spent the remainder of the night shivering in his nest, not sleeping, but meticulously constructing the lie he would tell, rehearsing the lines of a desperate courier, building the entire fictional edifice in his mind, his eyes staring into the darkness, no longer seeing the rotten wood of the ship, but the face of the captain, not as a target, but as an audience of one for the final. Deadly performance of the man who was no one. The final, deadly performance of the man who was no one. Demanded not just a script and a stage, but a complete transformation of the actor himself, a shedding of the ragged, anonymous shell he had inhabited for days and the careful construction of a new, temporary identity with a specific and urgent purpose, a character who could plausibly approach a Confederate captain on a busy street without arousing instant suspicion. A role that required a higher level of detail and credibility than the simple invisibility of a beggar or a laborer, and so as the first gray light of a cold, bleak dawn filtered through the cracks in the tarpaulin of his lair, the spy set about the meticulous work of building his new disguise from the scant materials he possessed, his mind shifting from the despair of the failed night to the focused intensity of a craftsman preparing his tools. The reversible coat was his foundation. He shook out the bundled garment, turning it back to its original, slightly less faded side, and used a handful of relatively clean rainwater from a pooled depression on the tarpaulin to smooth down his hair and wipe the worst of the grime from his face and hands. Not enough to make him look prosperous, but enough to suggest a man who had recently made an effort to present himself decently. A traveler, perhaps. His posture changed next, the slumped exhaustion of the waterfront drudge giving way to a straighter, more purposeful carriage, the walk of a man with a duty to perform, a man accustomed to covering long distances on foot, a military courier or a low-level functionary. But the key to the entire ruse lay in the prop he needed to create, the letter. This was his greatest challenge, a task that required resources he did not have and risks of an entirely new order. He needed paper, ink, and a pen, items common in any office or wealthy home but utterly inaccessible in his current world of rot and refuse. He needed to know the captain's full name and his exact regiment, details he had been unable to ascertain from a distance. And he needed a convincing military seal, an impossibility that he would have to simulate with a crude forgery using whatever he could find. The acquisition of these materials would require a foray into the heart of the city during daylight hours, a terrifying prospect that meant moving through crowded spaces where wanted posters might already be proliferating, where eyes were sharp and curiosity was high. He waited until the city was fully awake, the sounds of commerce and industry replacing the nighttime silence, and then he left the relative safety of the ship's skeleton, his senses screaming at the exposure, every nerve ending feeling the weight of countless unseen glances. He became a man with a minor errand, his eyes scanning not for threats now, but for opportunities, for an open, unguarded window to a clerk's office, for a dropped piece of correspondence near the post office, for any chance to acquire the precious tools of his deception. He haunted the edges of the War Department building, not daring to get too close, but watching the comings and goings of junior officers, hoping to catch a name, a unit designation, and was rewarded when he saw the captain himself arrive, limping up the steps, and a fellow officer called out, "Morning, Captain Bridger! How's the leg today?" And the captain, turning, replied, "Stiff as a board, Saunders, but I'll manage," before disappearing inside. Bridger. The name landed in the spy's mind with the force of a physical blow. Captain Bridger. The ghost now had a name, making the target terrifyingly, personally real. The regiment was still a mystery, but the name was a critical start. Next, he needed paper. He took a calculated risk, entering a small, crowded printer's shop under the pretense of asking for directions, and while the elderly proprietor was turned away, his fingers, moving with a pickpocket's speed he didn't know he possessed, closed around a single sheet of fine, cream-colored writing paper and a small, half-used bottle of ink that sat on a cluttered desk near the door. Slipping them into his pocket, and exiting with a mumbled thanks before the man could turn around, his heart thundering against his ribs. The pen was easier. He snapped a suitable goose feather from a pillow discarded on a rubbish heap, and used his sharpened piece of metal to carve a crude nib. Now came the most dangerous part of the day. He needed a quiet, sheltered place to compose the forgery, a task that required light and concentration, and he found it in the most audacious of locations, the public library. It was a calculated insanity. A man of his current appearance entering a place of learning would draw stares, but it was also a place of quiet solitude, and crucially, had individual writing desks tucked into carrels. He waited until the reading room was at its busiest, the lunch hour, and then he slipped in, keeping his head down, moving with a purpose that suggested he belonged, and found an empty desk in a dim corner. His hands trembled slightly as he laid out his stolen goods. He had to work quickly. He knew the formal language of military dispatches, and he poured all that knowledge into the note, writing in a tight, efficient script he hoped would pass for an aide-de-camp's hand. Asterisk. Captain Thaddeus Bridger, 14th Virginia Infantry, presently assigned to Richmond headquarters. Sir, I am directed by Major General J.B. Stewart to inform you that Private Elias Crocker of your former Company B, a man under your command at Sharpsburg, lies mortally wounded at Chimborazo Hospital. He has repeatedly asked for you, claiming to have intelligence of a most urgent nature regarding an encounter during the retreat from that engagement. He insists he can speak only to you. Your immediate attendance is requested and considered a matter of duty. I am to escort you. Respectfully, Corporal J. Henry, Courier, Stewart's staff. Asterisk. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, playing on duty, camaraderie, the specific detail of Antietam, Sharpsburg to the Confederates, and the name of the flamboyant Stewart, whose wide-ranging operations often involved independent couriers. He blotted the ink, folded the paper, and for a seal, he used a dab of red wax he found sealing a jar of paste on another desk, pressing it with the crude imitation of a signet ring he carved into a piece of softwood using his knife. It wouldn't withstand scrutiny, but it didn't need to. It just needed to look official at a glance in the hand of an anxious, determined courier. He slipped the finished letter into his inside pocket, a weapon more potent than any wire. The performance was prepared. The actor was in costume. Now, he had to find his audience and begin the play, a performance where a missed cue or a flawed line would mean not a bad review, but a death sentence. He left the library, his heart a cold, hard stone in his chest, and began his walk towards the War Department, to intercept Captain Bridger at the end of his workday, to look the man who held his life in his hands directly in the eye, and to lie to him with the conviction of a true believer, to lead him willingly to the river, and to his doom. The walk towards the War Department to intercept Captain Bridger at the end of his workday, to look the man who held his life in his hands directly in the eye and lie to him with the conviction of a true believer, to lead him willingly to the river and to his doom, was the longest and most psychologically torturous journey of the spy's life, each step on the familiar cobblestones feeling like a mile, each passing face in the crowd a potential accuser, his mind a roaring tempest of rehearsed lines and screaming vulnerabilities. The forged letter in his inside pocket burning against his chest like a brand, a physical manifestation of the audacious gamble he was about to undertake, a gamble that relied entirely on his ability to act, to project an aura of harried urgency and martial efficiency that would override any nascent suspicions Captain Bridger might be harboring after the previous night's eerie feeling of being watched, a performance that had to be perfect from the very first second, from the first glance, the first word, the first gesture. He positioned himself not directly outside the imposing doors of the War Department, where loitering would be noticed by the guards, but at a strategic point along the inevitable route Bridger would take towards Grace Street, a small plaza with a weathered bronze statue of some forgotten Virginian statesman. A place where one might reasonably pause to adjust a boot or wait for a comrade, and there he stood, trying to control his breathing, to still the frantic beating of his heart, his body thrumming with a nervous energy that he had to forcibly channel into the demeanor of a weary but dedicated courier who had been searching for his man all afternoon. His eyes constantly scanning the stream of gray-clad officers now flowing from the building's doors, the end of the day's work releasing a tide of men back into the city, and then he saw him, the familiar, slightly uneven gait, the fair head bent slightly against the chill wind that had picked up, Captain Bridger looking tired, preoccupied, his mind likely on a warm supper and a quiet evening, a man looking forward to the comforts of routine, utterly unaware that he was walking into the meticulously laid web of a spider who had been studying his every move for days. The spy felt a jolt of pure, undiluted fear, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow which he quickly wiped away with his sleeve, his mouth going dry, and then he stepped forward, his movement purposeful but not aggressive, intercepting the captain's path with a respectful but firm urgency, his hand coming up in a semblance of a salute, his voice, when he spoke, carefully modulated into a tone of respectful urgency, with a touch of a rural Virginian accent, perhaps from the Shenandoah Valley. "Captain Bridger? Sir, Captain Thaddeus Bridger of the 14th Virginia?" he asked, his voice cutting through the captain's reverie. Bridger stopped, startled, his eyes focusing on the man before him, taking in the worn but decent coat, the tired but earnest face, the posture of a soldier, a familiar type, a courier or a low-ranking aide. "Yes? That's me," he said, his expression one of mild curiosity, no flicker of recognition in his eyes for the face that haunted the spy's nightmares, a relief so potent it was almost dizzying. "Corporal Henry, sir, from General Stuart's dispatch corps," the spy said, the lie flowing smoothly, convincingly, from his lips, his body angled in a posture of subservient urgency. "I've been searching for you for the better part of 2 hours, sir. Apologies for the abruptness." He reached into his inner pocket, his movements deliberate, not furtive, and produced the folded, sealed letter, handing it to the captain. "I've been directed to give you this and to await your response, sir. It's a matter of some urgency." Captain Bridger took the letter, his brow furrowed, a slight wariness now entering his eyes, the memory of last night's strange feeling perhaps stirring. He broke the crude wax seal, the spy held his breath, and unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the contents. The spy watched his face intently, reading every micro-expression, every flicker of emotion, first confusion, then a dawning sadness at the name of Private Crocker, then a sharpening of focus at the mention of urgent intelligence, and finally, a resolute sense of duty settling over his features. The forgery had worked. The hooks of camaraderie and obligation were set deep. Bridger looked up, his eyes now filled with a concerned determination. "Per Crocker. A good man. Chimborazo, you say? That's a fair walk," he said, his voice heavy. The note says you're to escort me? Yes, sir. My orders are to see you directly to his bedside and then return to the general with your assessment of the intelligence, whatever it may be, the spy said, layering the lie with another lie, reinforcing the urgency and the chain of command. The hospital will be settling for the evening, sir. We should make haste. Bridger nodded, folding the letter and tucking it into his own pocket. Of course. Lead the way, Corporal. And just like that, the prey was willingly following the hunter. The spy turned, beginning the walk towards the riverfront and the isolated stretch of dock he had chosen for the final act, his back feeling intensely vulnerable, expecting at any moment to feel a hand on his shoulder, to hear a shout, to have the entire ruse collapse. But Captain Bridger simply walked beside him, his limp noticeable. His mind clearly preoccupied with thoughts of his dying soldier and the mysterious intelligence, making small talk about the weather, about the strains of war. And the spy had to respond, to build the character of Corporal Henry, to invent stories about serving under Stuart, to keep the conversation flowing naturally, all while leading a man to his death, the cognitive dissonance of the situation threatening to shatter his carefully constructed calm, the wire in his pocket feeling heavier with every step that brought them closer to the river, to the place where the sounds of the city faded and were replaced by the sigh of the wind and the dark, swirling whisper of the current. He could see the place ahead, a dilapidated wharf used for unloading raw timber, deserted at this hour, the long shadows of the late afternoon stretching across it like grasping fingers. This was it. The stage was set. The performance was nearing its climax. He slowed his pace slightly, allowing the captain to draw almost even with him, his hand moving slowly, imperceptibly, towards his pocket, his fingers finding the cold, wooden handles of the wire, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm that he was sure was audible in the stillness, every sense hyper-aware of the man beside him, of the rhythm of his breathing, the sound of his boots on the planks. The moment of truth arriving with the terrible, inexorable force of a tide. He took a final, steadying breath, his muscles coiling, the friendly expression on his face hardening into a mask of lethal intent, and he turned to face Captain Bridger, the loop of the wire held taut between his hands, ready to make the final, decisive move that would end the threat forever and complete his own transformation into the eternal, nameless ghost of the Confederacy. The final, decisive move that would end the threat forever and complete his own transformation into the eternal, nameless ghost of the Confederacy was arrested in the very instant of its execution, his body coiled like a spring, the wire a hair's breadth from encircling the captain's neck, when the man he was about to kill, seemingly oblivious to the imminent violence, spoke not a plea for mercy or a shout of alarm, but a quiet, heartfelt statement that struck the spy with the force of a physical blow. "I remember you," Captain Bridger said, his voice low, not filled with fear or accusation, but with a strange, profound wonder, his eyes not on the wire, but on the spy's face, seeing past the grime and the strain and the manufactured persona of Corporal Henry, seeing directly through to the core of the man he had encountered in the mud and smoke of Antietam. The spy froze, utterly paralyzed, the wire trembling in his hands, his entire plan, his resolve, his very sense of self, shattering in that single, devastating moment of recognition, his mind screaming that it was a trick, a desperate gambit, but the captain's eyes held no guile, only a dawning, incredible clarity. "In the cornfield," Bridger continued, his voice barely above a whisper, yet every word landing like a cannon shot in the tense silence between them. "You gave me water. I was drowning in my own blood, and the world was going dark, and then you were there. I thought you were an angel, or a fever dream. I never told anyone. Who would have believed me? A Yankee angel on the field at Sharpsburg." The spy could only stare, his arms still raised, the weapon forgotten in his hands, the breath caught in his throat, the world reduced to this single, impossible point of connection. All the intricate layers of his deception, his carefully constructed identities as Elias Finch and the Wraith and Corporal Henry, peeled away under the weight of that simple, unvarnished truth, leaving him naked and exposed, not as a spy or a killer, but as the man who had performed that one, inexplicable act of kindness. The captain's gaze then flickered down to the wire, its purpose horrifyingly obvious, and a deep sadness filled his eyes, but still, remarkably, no fear. "So this is why?" he asked, his voice heavy with understanding. This is what that moment has come to. You saving my life then has led you to take it now. He didn't back away, didn't cry out. He just stood there, waiting, his fate held in the trembling hands of the man before him. The spy felt a seismic shift within himself, a fundamental cracking of the icy resolve that had sustained him through days of fear and planning. The image he had clung to, the captain as a mere threat, a problem to be eliminated, was obliterated, replaced by the living, breathing man who had carried the memory of his face not as a weapon, but as a secret talisman, a story of humanity from a place of inhumanity. The violence that had felt necessary, justified, even inevitable, now seemed monstrous, a desecration of that single good thing he had done in the hell of war. The wire fell from his numb fingers, clattering softly on the wooden planks of the wharf, the sound absurdly loud in the stillness. He took a staggering step back, his legs threatening to buckle under him, the enormity of what he had been about to do crashing down upon him with a nausea-inducing force. He wasn't a ghost, he was a man, and he had been seconds away from committing a murder that would have forever poisoned the memory of his own moment of mercy. They know your name. The spy finally rasped, his voice raw, stripped of all pretense, the accent of Corporal Henry gone, replaced by his natural, neutral tones. The Wraith. They have a sketch. They're hunting me. You're the only one who can connect me to that face. Captain Bridger looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he did something utterly astonishing. He slowly, deliberately, bent down, his bad leg stiff, and picked up the fallen wire. He held it in his hands not as a threat, but as an object of profound sadness, studying its cruel simplicity. Then he looked back at the spy, his eyes clear and decisive. Then you need to disappear more completely than you ever have before, he said, his voice firm, that of an officer used to command. And I need to forget I ever saw you. Twice. He turned and, with a powerful heave, threw the wire far out into the dark, swirling waters of the James River. It vanished with a silent splash, taking with it the instrument of death and the immediate threat. He turned back to the stunned spy. The man you're looking for, the one who saw you, he's gone. He died in that field. The man who came back is someone else. He took a limping step closer, his voice dropping even further. Now listen to me carefully. There's a freight wagon, loaded with raw cotton for the Danville depot. It leaves from the siding behind the Tredegar works at midnight. The driver will be drunk by 10. You can be in the bales unseen. Danville is a chaos of supplies and prisoners. From there, you can find a way back to your lines. It is the only chance you have. He was giving him an escape route. Saving him. Again. The spy could only nod, his mind reeling, unable to process this staggering reversal. Why? He finally managed to whisper, the question encompassing everything. Bridger's face was grim. Because a world where that moment in the cornfield meant nothing is a world not worth fighting for. Now go. And never, ever let me see you again. Without another word, Captain Bridger turned and began walking back the way they had come, his limp pronounced, leaving the spy alone on the dark wharf, not as an executioner, not as a hunter, but as a man who had been granted an impossible reprieve, his mission a catastrophic failure, his identity still in jeopardy, but his soul, against all odds, inexplicably, undeniably intact. The path to becoming no one had just been rendered infinitely more complex. The path to becoming no one had just been rendered infinitely more complex, not by external forces of counterintelligence, or the brutal mechanics of war, but by the seismic internal cataclysm of a single act of mercy reciprocated, a debt of life acknowledged and repaid in the most stunningly unexpected manner. Leaving the spy standing on the desolate wharf not with the cold satisfaction of a mission accomplished, but with the profound, world-altering disorientation of a man whose entire moral compass had just been spun on its axis, the cold, clinical calculus that had governed his every action for years shattered by the warmth of a humanity he had believed himself incapable of receiving, let alone deserving, his mind struggling to recalibrate. To process the fact that the man who held the absolute power to destroy him had instead chosen to grant him a gift more valuable than his own life, a chance, not just at survival, but at redemption, a chance to prove that the moment of compassion in the cornfield was not a fleeting weakness but the core of an identity he had buried beneath layers of lies and violence. The figure of Captain Bridger disappeared into the gloom of the Richmond evening, leaving behind a silence that was no longer threatening but was instead vast, heavy, and filled with a terrifying new kind of responsibility, the weight of the captain's gamble settling on the spy's shoulders like a mantle, a sacred trust that he must now honor not for his cause, not for his generals, but for himself. For the ghost of the man he used to be before the war, and for the unexpected ally he had found. In the most improbable of places. The practical implications of this staggering turn of events began to crash down upon him. The elaborate fiction of Corporal Henry was now a dangerous liability, a character that had interacted directly with Bridger, and which could be described to authorities if the captain's resolve wavered or if he was ever questioned under duress. The entire strategy of erasure had to be rethought from the ground up. Not as a violent severing of a thread, but as a delicate unspooling, a disappearance that would leave no ripple, no body, no unanswered questions that might circle back to haunt the man who had let him go. The offered escape route, the freight wagon to Danville, was a lifeline, but it was also a potential trap, a path that Bridger knew, and the spy's deeply ingrained paranoia, though momentarily stunned, could not be entirely silenced, whispering that this could all be an elaborate ruse, a way to lure him into a false sense of security before the net closed around him. But looking into Bridger's eyes, he had seen the truth of it, the raw, uncalculated decency that had overruled military duty and personal safety, and so he made the conscious, terrifying decision to trust, to accept the gift, to believe in the fragile thread of humanity that connected them across the impassable divide of the war. This meant his time in Richmond was now measured in hours, not days, a frantic race against the clock to reach the Tredegar Works by midnight, a journey that would take him back through the heart of the city where his likeness was still undoubtedly plastered on walls, where patrols would be looking for the wraith, and where he now had to move not as a hunter or a phantom, but as a man carrying a precious, fragile secret that could get them both killed if he was caught. He left the wharf, his movements once again those of the anonymous, shuffling laborer, but his internal state was entirely new. The cold killer had been exorcised, replaced by a raw, vulnerable determination that was in many ways more terrifying, because it had something left to lose. He avoided main thoroughfares, sticking to the same labyrinth of alleys that had served him before, but every sense was heightened to an even greater degree, not just for threats to his own person, but for any sign that Captain Bridger's actions might have been discovered, any unusual military activity, any heightened alertness among the patrols. But the city seemed to hum with its usual tense, weary rhythm. The machinery of the manhunt proceeding on its pre-established tracks, unaware that its primary target had just been given a get-out-of-hell-free card by the one man who could identify him. The walk to the Tredegar Iron Works was an agony of tension, each corner turned a potential confrontation, each distant shout sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system, the forged letter in his pocket now a ticking bomb that he needed to dispose of, which he did by tearing it into 1,000 tiny pieces and scattering them into different foul-smelling gutters along the way. The lie that had brought him to the brink of murder now dissolved into the filth of the city. He reached the vast, sprawling complex of the ironworks as the moon rose, its furnaces belching smoke and flame into the night sky, painting the surrounding area in a hellish, orange glow, the air thick with the smell of coal and molten metal. The siding Bridger had mentioned was on the far side, away from the main gates, a place of shadows and looming, silent freight cars. Finding the right wagon was a process of elimination and observation. He lurked in the deep shadows of a stack of iron ingots, watching the few workers still moving about, until he saw a particular freight driver, a large man with a florid face, take a long pull from a clay flask before stumbling towards a shanty, clearly done for the night. The wagon he had been attending to was piled high with bulky, loosely tied bales of raw cotton, a perfect, suffocating hiding place. Waiting until the area was completely deserted, the spy moved with a swift, silent efficiency, climbing the side of the wagon and burrowing deep into the center of the bales, pulling the fibrous material around him until he was completely entombed, the world reduced to the close, dusty smell of cotton and the frantic beating of his own heart. It was a claustrophobic's nightmare, a living burial, but it was also safety, invisibility, his final severance from Richmond. he heard the arrival of the replacement driver hours later, a man humming tunelessly, the crack of a whip, the groan of axles, and then the lurching, rolling motion as the wagon began its journey, carrying him away from the city that had been his prison and his battlefield, away from the captain who had saved him twice, away from the identity of the Wraith, and towards the uncertain future of a man who was truly, completely, and utterly no one, his past erased not by his own hand, but by an act of grace from his enemy, a paradox that would define whatever life he had left to live. The war was not over, his mission was a failure, but as the wagon rolled into the darkness, he realized he was, for the first time since he could remember, free. Free, but freedom for a man who was known one was a vast, terrifying, and profoundly empty expanse, a void without borders or landmarks, a state of being that was as much a prison as the city he had just escaped, the claustrophobic embrace of the cotton bales and the lurching, groaning freight wagon not a confinement but a cocoon, a transitional space between two existences, the first, a life of defined purpose, of clear enemies and allies, of intricate lies and a sharp, lethal identity, now irretrievably dead, shed like a skin back on the Richmond wharf, and the second, a formless, unknown future, waiting for him in the chaotic vortex of Danville, a future he was utterly unprepared for, his mind, so adept at calculating risk and strategizing survival in a hostile urban landscape, reeling at the sheer, blank slate impossibility of what came next. The physical journey was an ordeal in itself. The rough, fibrous cotton dust choked his lungs and filled his eyes with a gritty film, the swaying of the wagon on the poorly maintained road threatening to crush him between the immense weight of the bales with every jolt and turn, the darkness absolute, the sounds reduced to the creak of wood and metal, the snort of the team, the driver's occasional curses, and the relentless, monotonous rumble of the wheels, a sensory deprivation chamber that left him alone with the echoing aftermath of the last 24 hours, the image of Captain Bridger's face, not in fear or anger, but in that state of sad, understanding resolve, playing over and over behind his eyes, a ghost that would now forever haunt him, a permanent question mark etched into his soul. What did one do after such a thing? How did one simply return to the Union lines, report the failure of his mission, and resume the life of a spy, knowing that his continued existence was a direct result of a Confederate officer's breach of duty? Could he even look his superiors in the eye again, knowing that he owed his life to the enemy, that he had held the solution to his problem in his hands and had chosen, or rather had been compelled by a force greater than his training, to let it go? The concept of duty, which had been the bedrock of his life for years, now felt slippery, ambiguous, a flag planted in shifting sand. The war itself, the great, bloody conflict that had provided the backdrop and the meaning for all his actions, now seemed like a distant, absurd tragedy, a game of giants that had nearly forced him to extinguish a spark of human decency that had, in the end, saved him. He wasn't just escaping Richmond, he was escaping the entire, rigid framework of his life, and the weight of that liberation was crushing. Time lost all meaning in the dark, jolting womb of the wagon. It could have been hours or days, he had no way of knowing, his body aching from immobility and thirst, his stomach a hollow knot of hunger, until finally, the character of the sounds outside began to change, the driver's shouts becoming more frequent, the noise of other wagons and voices growing around them. The smell of coal smoke and river mud replaced by the distinct odor of a large, crowded, and frantic military depot, the smell of horses, of unwashed men, of cooked rations, and underlying it all, the faint, sweet smell of despair that clung to places where prisoners were kept. Danville. The wagon slowed to a crawl amidst a cacophony of shouts, whinnies, and the crash of loading cargo, and he knew this was his moment, his point of ejection into the unknown. He waited for a particular lurch that rocked the wagon sharply, and in that moment of noise and distraction, he began to dig his way out, the cotton fibers tearing at his hands and clothes, until he broke through into the shockingly cold night air, blinking against the sudden light of countless torches and lanterns that illuminated a scene of organized bedlam. He was in a massive rail yard, a teeming anthill of Confederate logistics, surrounded by stacks of crates, barrels of salt pork, artillery pieces being loaded onto flat cars, and everywhere, the press of gray uniforms, soldiers, teamsters, engineers, and the hated provost guards, their eyes scanning the crowds for deserters or trouble. He dropped from the side of the wagon, landing in a shadowy gap between two stacks of wooden crates, his body screaming in protest after hours of cramped immobility, and immediately adopted the persona of an exhausted, disoriented laborer, stumbling into the stream of men, keeping his head down, his eyes frantically searching for any source of water, any discarded scrap of food, any glimpse of a potential opportunity to complete his escape. The scale of the depot was overwhelming, a city within a city dedicated to the war effort, and he realized that getting lost here would be easy, but finding a way out, especially north towards Union lines, would be a monumental task. His first goal was sustenance. He found a water barrel meant for horses and drank deeply, the water tasting of wood and algae but washing the cotton dust from his throat, and then he managed to snatch a half-eaten piece of hardtack from a barrel where a group of soldiers were being issued rations, the stale, rock-like biscuit a feast to his starved system. Fortified slightly, his mind began to work again, assessing the landscape. He saw long, grim, wooden barracks surrounded by high fences and armed guards, the prisoner of war camp, a place of unimaginable suffering and a potent reminder of the fate he had narrowly avoided. He saw trains loaded with wounded men arriving from the front, their moans a constant, low drone under the other noises. He saw harried clerks with clipboards directing supplies. This was the underbelly of the Confederate war machine, and it was here, in this chaos, that he had to find his path to freedom. He couldn't simply walk out. The depot would be tightly controlled. He needed to become part of the machine's flow, to find a weakness in its logistics. He noticed a train of empty boxcars that had just been unloaded, its engine idling, smoke puffing into the night sky, and a thought began to form, a desperate, dangerous idea. The train would likely be returning to a supply point, perhaps even north towards the contested areas. If he could get aboard, hide in an empty car, it was a risk, but it was a direction, a purpose. He began to move towards the train, a ghost once more, but a ghost with a new, fragile hope, his freedom no longer an abstract concept but a tangible goal measured in feet and inches between himself and the dark, open door of an empty boxcar waiting on the siding, a doorway to the next chapter of his endless, nameless journey. A doorway to the next chapter of his endless, nameless journey, the dark. Gaping maw of the empty boxcar represented not just a potential vehicle for physical escape from the teeming, hostile chaos of the Danville depot, but a metaphysical passage into the next iteration of his existence, a stark, rattling emptiness that perfectly mirrored the void within himself, a void left by the shedding of all previous purpose and identity, and as he moved towards it through the chaotic landscape of shouting teamsters, clanging chains, and hissing steam, his body instinctively adopting the harried, preoccupied slouch of a depot worker who belonged exactly nowhere and everywhere at once, his eyes perpetually downcast but missing no crucial detail, his entire being focused on the simple, monumental goal of crossing those final 50 yards of open ground and pulling his weary frame up into that promising darkness without attracting the notice of the bored-looking guard leaning against a signal post nearby or the engine crew who were busy checking pressures and gauges at the front of the train. Their figures small and distorted in the shimmering heat haze, rising from the locomotive's boiler. The air itself was thick with the particulates of war, cold dust, sawdust from crates, the sweet rotten smell of spoiled grain from a burst sack, and the ever-present, acrid tang of fear sweat that seemed to rise from the thousands of men, free and imprisoned, who inhabited this purgatory, and he used this sensory overload as his cover, a blanket of confusion under which a single, determined man could move like a minnow through murky water. A sudden commotion erupted to his left. A wagon had lost a wheel, spilling its cargo of salted pork barrels onto the tracks, causing a terrific crash and a wave of shouted curses that instantly drew the attention of the nearby guard and a cluster of other soldiers. And seizing this gift of diverted attention, the spy broke from his aimless shuffle into a swift, purposeful stride, closing the distance to the boxcar in a handful of heartbeats, his hands gripping the cold, rough iron of the door handle, his muscles straining as he hauled himself up and into the absolute blackness within, rolling immediately into a dark corner behind a pile of discarded, foul-smelling sacking that seemed to be the car's only contents, his body curling into the smallest possible target, his breath held, his ears straining for any shout of discovery. None came. The commotion outside continued, effectively masking the sound of his entry. He was in. The boxcar was a freezing, metal tomb, its floor littered with sharp splinters and rusty iron filings. But it was moving. He could feel the faint, shuddering vibration of the idling engine through the floor, a promise of imminent departure, of progress away from this place. He allowed himself a single, shuddering exhalation, the tension in his shoulders easing a fraction, but his mind, that relentless engine, was already analyzing the new set of terrifying variables. Where was this train going? How long would the journey take? Would the car be searched or inspected at any point before departure or during the journey? What if it was shunted onto a siding for days? He had no water, no food beyond the crumb of hardtack in his pocket, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as the night deepened, the cold metal of the car leaching what little body heat he had left. Survival now depended on absolute stillness, on conserving every ounce of energy, on becoming a dormant creature waiting for its chance to emerge. After an interminable wait filled with the shouts of men and the clanging of couplings, the train gave a massive, metallic lurch and began to move, slowly, agonizingly slowly at first, the wheels screeching in protest against the rails, then building momentum, the rhythmic clack-clack-clack of the wheels becoming a steady, hypnotic drumbeat that measured his distance from Danville, from Richmond, from Captain Bridger, from the entire nightmare of the past days. He risked a glance through a narrow gap in the slatted wall of the car, watching the flickering lights of the depot recede into the distance, replaced by the deep, featureless blackness of the Virginia countryside, a darkness so complete it felt like being hurled through the void of space, unmoored from any recognizable reality. The freedom he had felt earlier now mutated into a profound and isolating loneliness, a sense of being the last man on earth, a speck of consciousness hurtling through an indifferent universe. With the immediate threat of capture receding, his thoughts inevitably returned to the captain, to the stunning grace of that act on the wharf, and he was confronted with a debt that could never be repaid in any conventional sense, a debt that obligated him to make that sacrifice mean something, to ensure that the captain's gamble on his humanity was not a fatal error but an investment in something good. But what could that be? He was a failed spy, a deserter in spirit if not in fact, a man with no name and no country, hurtling through the night in a freezing boxcar. How does such a man honor a debt of life? The answer, when it came, was not a grand plan, but a quiet, internal shift. He would not return to his spymasters in Washington. He could not. To do so would be to drag the pure, unsanctioned morality of Bridger's act into the cynical, utilitarian machinery of the war effort, to debase it into just another piece of intelligence to be filed away. His mission was over. The Wraith was dead. Elias Finch was dead. The man in the boxcar was someone new, someone born in the moment that wire fell to the wharf. His duty now was not to the Union or the Confederacy, but to that singular, shared moment of humanity in the cornfield. His purpose would be to protect it, to honor it by living a life that justified it. This meant disappearing completely, not just from the Confederacy, but from the Union as well. He would have to desert in truth. He would have to find a way off this train far from any major city, to vanish into the vastness of America, to become a farmer, a tradesman, a nobody in a small town where the war was a distant newspaper story. It was a terrifying prospect, a leap into an abyss of obscurity, but it was the only path that made sense of the mercy he had been shown. The train raced on through the night, its rhythm a lullaby of escape, and as the first faint glow of dawn began to tinge the sky, revealing the rolling, forested hills of the Virginia Piedmont, he knew he had to make his move soon. Once the sun was fully up, the risk of being discovered during a stop would be too great. He began to watch the landscape more intently through the slats, looking for a place where the train might slow enough for a jump, a steep grade, a curve, a water tower stop. His opportunity came as the train began to climb a long, sloping hill, its speed reducing to a labored crawl, the engine straining against the gradient. Outside, the landscape was perfect, a thick, untouched forest of pine and hardwood, a blanket of deep shadow despite the growing dawn, a place where a man could vanish forever. This was it. With muscles stiff and protesting from the cold and inactivity, he moved to the door, sliding it open just enough to squeeze through, the pre-dawn wind whipping at his ragged clothes, the clack-clack-clack of the wheels slowing to a manageable rhythm. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cold, clean air of the woods, a stark contrast to the foul smells of the depot and the boxcar, and then he jumped, pushing himself away from the train with all his strength, curling into a ball as he hit the steep, gravelly embankment, the world becoming a violent, tumbling kaleidoscope of sky, trees, and pain as he rolled down the slope, rocks tearing at his skin. His bad shoulder screaming in protest, until he finally came to a rest in a damp thicket of ferns at the bottom, the sound of the train fading into the distance, leaving behind an immense, overwhelming silence. He lay there for a long time, bruised, bleeding, and utterly, completely free. He was in the middle of nowhere. He had no food, no water, no shelter, no plan, and no name. But he was alive. And for the first time, his life was entirely his own to define. The man who was no one had finally reached the beginning. The beginning for the man who was no one was a symphony of raw, physical agony and a terrifying, exhilarating silence that was so profound it felt like a physical pressure on his eardrums, the fading rumble of the train not just disappearing into the distance but seeming to take with it the last vestiges of the world he had known, leaving him alone in the deep pre-dawn chill of a Virginia forest that stretched in every direction, an endless sea of trees that promised both sanctuary and a slow, anonymous death from exposure and starvation if he did not immediately master its unforgiving rules. Every inch of his body protested the violent exit from the train. His shoulder, an old injury from a long-forgotten mission, throbbed with a deep, hot pain that suggested he had re-aggravated it severely during the tumbling fall down the gravel embankment. His hands and forearms were lacerated from the rocks and brambles, and a sharp, stabbing sensation in his ribs with every deep breath hinted at a possible crack or a severe bruise, a catalogue of damages that would have sent a normal man to his knees weeping, but which he could only acknowledge as the entry fee for his freedom, a price he was willing to pay 1,000 times over. Pushing himself up from the damp bed of ferns, he took a first, staggering inventory of his new reality. He was in a shallow ravine, a small, icy stream trickling over mossy stones a few feet away, providing the first and most crucial necessity, water. He crawled to it, submerging his whole head in the biting cold flow, drinking deeply until his stomach ached, the shocking cold numbing his pains and sharpening his mind, washing away the grime of the boxcar and the blood from his scratches, a baptism into his new, primal existence. Water was solved, for now. Next was shelter and assessing his resources, which were pitifully few, the clothes on his back, now torn and wet, the reversible coat that was his most valuable possession, the sharpened piece of metal that had been his only tool for weeks, and the absolute, unshakable will to survive that had been forged in the fires of Richmond's streets and tempered on the wharf with Captain Bridger. He was a human animal now, stripped of all pretension in society, and his needs were an animal's: warmth, safety, food. The rising sun was beginning to filter through the dense canopy, providing meager warmth and light, and he used it to scout his immediate vicinity, finding a small, natural cave formed by a tumble of large boulders and a fallen pine tree, a space just large enough for him to crawl into, dry and sheltered from the wind. It was a den, a lair for the creature he had become. Gathering armfuls of dry pine needles and fallen leaves, he made a rough nest in the back of the space, a pathetic attempt at insulation against the cold ground, but it was something. Shelter, of a sort, was solved. Food was the next, and most pressing, problem. His stomach was a clenched fist of hunger, and he knew that strength would fade rapidly without sustenance. His mind, that superb instrument trained for espionage and assassination, now turned its entire focus to the art of primitive survival, accessing half-remembered lessons from a childhood long buried under layers of false identities, memories of trapping rabbits with his father on their Ohio farm, of identifying edible plants and mushrooms. He spent the daylight hours in a pain-fueled, desperate hunt, moving slowly and carefully through the woods, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of game, tracks, droppings, runs, and for any vegetation he could safely eat. He found a patch of wild onions, digging them up with his fingers and eating them raw, their sharp, pungent flavor a feast. He found a handful of late-season blackberries, withered and tart but full of precious sugars. It was not enough, but it was a start. His attempts at trapping with cleverly arranged rocks and sticks failed miserably, the rabbits proving far wiser than his clumsy efforts. As dusk began to fall, the temperature plummeted, and a new kind of fear set in, the fear of the dark, of the cold, of the absolute isolation. Huddled in his rocky den, Shivering uncontrollably despite his coat being pulled tightly around him, he faced the true emptiness of his freedom. There were no sounds of civilization, no distant hum of a city, no glow of lights on the horizon. There was only the sigh of the wind in the pines, the occasional hoot of an owl, the scuttling of unseen things in the leaves, and the relentless, gnawing cold that seeped into his bones. This was not the romantic freedom of adventure stories. This was a harsh, brutal, and lonely struggle for another sunrise. In that deep darkness, his thoughts turned inward, away from immediate survival and towards the philosophical abyss he had leaped into. Who was he, if not the Wraith? What was his purpose, if not to serve the Union cause? The answers were not there. He was a blank page, and the pen was broken. The only identity that felt real, that felt earned, was that of the man in the cornfield, the man who had offered water. That was the core, the only truth he had left. Everything else, the lies, the killings, the manipulations, had been layers of armor around that core. Now the armor was gone, stripped away by failure and mercy, leaving the raw, vulnerable truth exposed to the elements. He had to build a new man from that single, foundational moment. But how does a man build a life from a single act of kindness performed in the midst of hell? The question was too vast, too terrifying to confront in the shivering dark. Survival first. Philosophy later. He passed the night in a state of half-frozen wakefulness, his mind drifting between nightmares of Confederate prisons and waking visions of Captain Bridger's face, the line between memory and hallucination blurring in the hypothermic haze. When the gray light of dawn finally returned, it found him weaker, colder, and hungrier, but still stubbornly, defiantly alive. The man who was no one had survived his first day of freedom. The journey of 1,000 miles, of a lifetime, had begun with a single, painful, desperate step into the unknown woods, and he was prepared to take another, and then another, until he found whatever it was he was now supposed to be.